Quiet black man entering the system. Another number lost behind concrete walls. But what they didn't know was that silence can hide storms. And this man's past was darker than the prison itself. The guards watched him like prey. The inmates tested him like a game. But every move they made brought them closer to a truth they could never imagine. Because this new inmate wasn't what anyone thought he was. What happens when the hunted becomes the hunter? Before Redmore Prison, Darren Thorne lived in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows men who've seen too much. Once a disciplined soldier, Darren had spent years trying to rebuild his life after being falsely profiled, labeled, and broken by a system that never saw past his skin. To the world, he was just another black man with a record. To himself, he was a man trying to find redemption. When the court sentenced him, no one cared to hear the story behind his scars, just the color of his skin and the charges on paper. Redmore was his new home, a place where reputation ruled and weakness was preyed upon. The moment Darren stepped through those gates, whispers followed. The guards eyed him with suspicion, the inmates with hunger. They didn't know who he really was. They didn't care. In a place built on hate and dominance, being quiet and black made you a target. But Darren wasn't there to prove a point. He was there to survive. And sometimes, survival means letting the storm come to you before you strike back. From the moment Darren Thorne entered Redmore Prison, the walls seemed to whisper judgment. His silence was mistaken for weakness, his calm for fear. The guards, mostly white men hardened by years of power, treated him like a threat before he ever said a word. "Keep your eyes open on this one of them muttered, loud enough for Darren to hear. It wasn't about what he'd done. It was about who he was. In the yard, every step Darren took was measured, calculated. He kept to himself, watching how the system inside mirrored the one outside, divided by color, ruled by fear. The gangs had drawn invisible lines on the concrete. Cross the wrong one and you were done. Still, Darren refused to join any side. He had walked through fire before. He knew real strength didn't need an audience, but that quiet strength made him stand out even more. Razor, the self-proclaimed king of Redmore, didn't like being ignored. He ran his block like a dictator, and to him, every new inmate was a chance to prove control. When Darren didn't flinch, didn't bow, it ignited something ugly in Razor. "Thinks he's better than us," he sneered one afternoon, staring across the yard. Let's remind him where he is. It started small. Food missing from Darren's tray, his bunk overturned, his clothes soaked in the sink. The guards saw it happen and turned away. "Inmates handle their own problems," they'd say with smirks. Each act of harassment was meant to break him, but Darren absorbed it all like a stone against the storm. Days turned into weeks. Razor's crew grew bolder. They shoved Darren in the corridors, whispered slurs under their breath, mocking his skin, his silence, his defiance. Every insult was a spark landing on dry wood. Yet Darren's eyes never wavered. He had promised himself he'd never be the man they expected. Angry, violent, predictable. Then came the night that would change everything. In the dim light of the shower block, Razor and his crew cornered him. No guards, no witnesses, just the echo of dripping water and hatred. "You've been real quiet, Thorne," Razor growled, cracking his knuckles. "Let's see what color you bleed." The words cut deeper than the fists that followed, but in that chaos, that blur of rage and motion, something inside Darren snapped. Years of restraint, humiliation, and injustice ignited all at once. The quiet man they mocked was gone. In his place stood the ghost of his past, precise, unflinching, lethal. When it was over, Razor's crew lay scattered, groaning on the tiles. Darren stood among them, breathing steady, eyes calm as ever. He hadn't wanted violence, but in Redmore peace was never given. It had to be taken. And that night, everyone learned. Darren Thorne wasn't just another inmate. He was the storm they'd been warned about. The fight in the shower block spread through Redmore like wildfire. By morning, everyone had heard. The quiet black inmate had taken down Razor and his crew. Some called it self-defense. Others called it a riot. But the guards didn't care about the truth. To them, it was simple. A black man had caused chaos, and someone had to pay. Darren was dragged from his cell before sunrise. The guard slammed him against the wall, cuffs biting into his wrists. "You think you're a hero now?" One spat. "You people never learn." His head hit the concrete, but he didn't fight back. He'd learned long ago. In this world, resistance was just another excuse for punishment. They threw him into solitary. No hearing, no explanation. Just concrete, darkness, and silence. From behind the cold steel door, he could still hear the guards laughing in the hallways. "Guess the animal finally showed his teeth," one joked. Their words echoed louder than the isolation. It wasn't the beating that broke him. It was knowing that no matter how controlled, how calm, how restrained he tried to be, they still saw him as a threat. Days passed. The walls closed in. Darren replayed the moment over and over. Not the fight, but the look in Razor's eyes when he realized who he was facing. For a second, Razor had seen it. The truth behind the silence. Not weakness, but power, discipline, survival. The same power that terrified men on the outside was now his curse on the inside. When the warden finally entered the cell, he didn't bring justice. He brought judgment. "You could have just kept your head down, Thorne," he said coldly. "But you people never know when to stop." Darren looked up, eyes steady despite the bruises. "No," he whispered. "We just know when enough is enough." That line hung heavy in the air, the kind that makes even the walls listen. Weeks passed before Darren Thorne was released from solitary. By then, the story had already spread, twisted, reshaped, and stripped of truth. To the guards, he was a violent inmate who couldn't be controlled. To the prisoners, he was a legend, the man who stood his ground when the world tried to crush him. But to Darren, he was just tired. Tired of being misunderstood, tired of being judged before being seen. He walked the yard again, quieter than before, but no one dared to meet his eyes. Even Razor's old crew kept their distance. Respect in Redmore wasn't earned through power. It was taken through pain. Darren had taken his share, and then some. At night, as he stared through the narrow slit of his cell window, he thought about the outside world. A world that worked just like this prison, only bigger. Where color still decided guilt before a word was spoken. Where silence was survival, and anger was labeled as aggression. He realized Redmore wasn't just a prison made of walls and gates. It was a reflection of everything wrong beyond them. Every judgment, every stereotype, every system built to remind men like him that they didn't belong. But Darren's story wasn't about fear. It was about resistance. Quiet, relentless resistance. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from the system. It comes from standing your ground, even when the world calls you wrong. Darren Thorne's story reminds us that strength isn't about violence. It's about endurance. It's about surviving in a world that keeps trying to silence you. So, what would you do if silence was the only weapon you had left?